would like to introduce, first of all, my hometown. It's the easternmost town in Germany. And it is a Renaissance town. It is beautiful. It has been lovingly restored for the most part. And I'm homesick for it all the time. So, but we're back here. I'd like to start in 1945, in February of 1945. The war hadn't ended yet. It didn't end until May 8th, 1945. So I'd like to share with you what I have written about fleeing the city. On February 17th, 1945, 5 days after the firebombing of Dresden, my parents, my sister Ingrid, my brother Peter, and I fled to Aue, a small town located in the southwestern part of the state of Silesia. Since Aue was 211 kilometers from Görlitz, safety from air raids and the advancing Russian army seemed possible to my parents. The trip was slow and treacherous with low-flying enemy aircraft overhead. As we drove to Aue in my father's Hanomag, a German car produced in the 20s and 30s, Allied planes roared over us. Several times, my father pulled the car off the road into the forest to hide from the threatening enemy planes. He quickly decided it would be safer to spend our first night in Schönau, a rural community only 16 kilometers from Görlitz. My parents had previously arranged temporary housing for us in a hotel in Aue belonging to Frau Schimanda, a friend of the family. When we arrived, my father escorted us into the hotel, wished us a safe stay, climbed into his car, and drove back to Görlitz. My sister thought of the weeks in Aue as carefree, safe, and filled with plenty of food. She even had a crush on one of the young men there. But when the Deutsche Wehrmacht began to flee from the approaching Russian army, German soldiers crossed through Aue, discarding guns, rifles, grenades, and even insignia from their uniforms. My brother remembers watching the fleeing men as they tossed those items over a wall. The following day, he and another 10-year-old decided to explore what the soldiers had thrown behind the wall. It was Peter's turn to babysit me that day, so he sat me on top of a stone wall. The boys climbed over it and began to explore. Peter and his friend tossed grenades back and forth like footballs, examined revolvers and other weapons, and collected swastika insignias. Many of the medals were buried under old movie reels, flags, and propaganda booklets. When he finally took me off the wall to go back to the hotel, he had gathered an entire carton full of insignia and medals. Over the next weeks, my mother made her way back to Görlitz several times to be with my father. She hitchhiked along dangerous roads, never knowing which army she might encounter or who it was she hitchhiked with. Fearing one of the low-flying fighter planes would drop bombs on the road, she would scramble into a ditch or tall grass. My father remained in Görlitz and continued to run the business with his father and younger brother, Fritz. And so that was the first flight in my life. After the war, East Germany became a satellite state of Russia, and everything was dictated by Russia, and it was a very difficult time for people who lived there. And I would like to read to you of another impending flight. The night the lights went out. I loved winter evenings, and this December evening was especially cozy. The streets were dark and icy that night, and not many people were on Berliner Straße. Snow was falling heavily, making the streets almost impassable. All three of us were surprised to hear the doorbell ring. Family or friends who came to visit knew how to ring the doorbell twice. But just now the bell rang without stopping. I ran to the door and opened it cautiously. In the dim light of the staircase, 4 men in long black leather coats stood in front of our door. They were wearing high black boots, and all 4 of them wore gray hats, which they had pulled down over their faces. They pushed their way by me and through the door without taking off their hats. The tallest of the 4 men shouted, "Ist dein Vater zu Hause?" I answered that yes, my father was at home. I didn't know why he shouted because the house was very quiet. He leaned down and put his hand under my chin and looked into my face. I hated it when people did that. Besides, his eyes frightened me. He smelled of cigars and sweat. Before he turned away, he pinched my cheek and patted me on the head. I hated that even more. I told them that my parents were in the Herrenzimmer, the room usually reserved for my father and his men friends. But this was also the room where we would all sit when my parents had company. Without knocking, the men entered the Herrenzimmer. My mother was leaning forward in her small cane-back chair and stretched out and with the book still on her lap. My father got up out of his chair and stretched out his hand to greet the visitors. But the tallest of the 4 did not shake my father's hand. Instead, he said, "Volkspolizei," and added that they had orders to search the home. The Volkspolizei, the VP, was the much feared East German police. My father asked in an unsteady voice why our home had to be searched by the police. The man barked that he did not have to give any reason and removed his heavy coat. I noticed many colorful medals on his jacket and tried to count them. But he turned and ordered the other men to search desks, closets, drawers, and chests in every room. My mother waved me over to her and lifted me onto her lap. Her hands were ice cold. She pulled me close to her and wrapped her arms around me. We both watched my father pace back and forth. He told the men he'd be glad to help and assured that he had nothing to hide. The men ignored him. Just then, one of the men pulled a stack of papers from our big book cabinet where my mother kept her correspondence in a drawer. She tried to jump out of her chair, but I was still on her lap. She lifted me off and stepped toward the man. I stayed close behind her, hanging on to her skirt. "Meine Briefe," she said in a shaky voice. The man took a pocket knife from his coat and slit open the pink ribbon that held the papers together. The policeman saw that they were letters and wanted to know what kind of letters they were. My mother held out her hands. "Liebesbriefe von meinem Mann." She implored him to give back the love letters from her husband. The man looked at her, threw the letters back into the cabinet, and walked away. My mother's whole body trembled when she reached for her letters. The other men opened and closed doors and drawers down the hall. I heard them enter my room and open the cabinets and drawers. What about my doll Isabel, my books, my new ballet slippers? Would they take them away from me? Now the tall policeman walked over to my father's desk and began to open it. He pulled out all the drawers and started shuffling through the top drawer. I could see the vein on my father's temple bulging. That was his private desk, and no one had permission to open it. He took a step forward toward the desk, but my mother put her hand on his arm. My father stopped and put his hand over my mother's. All of a sudden, the lights went out. This happened often in the early evening hours. It was called Stromsperre, an intentional blackout. The newspaper had announced that blackouts would help save electricity. Now we all stood in the dark. The other men were coming back to the sitting room, stumbling and cursing. Fräulein Martha had stayed in the kitchen. but now she came in with a candle and placed it on my father's desk. The candlelight made me feel a little safer. Fräulein Martha straightened her apron and looked at my father. She looked frightened. My father told her she could leave. She looked at my mother and me. She pulled a handkerchief out of her apron pocket and held it to her eyes. Then she turned around and ran into the dark corridor. Everything was very quiet. The tall policeman turned to my father and bellowed now that they would be back at 7 a.m. the next morning. My father replied sternly that they were welcome to come back anytime, since he had absolutely nothing to hide. The man was still standing at my father's desk and said that they'd have to seal the desk until the next morning. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a dark red stick. He held it over the candle on the desk and until it began to drip. The drips formed a red lake, which the man let flow over the edge of the desktop and over the closed door. Then he pulled a metal stamp out of his other pocket and pushed it hard into the hot liquid. When he pulled the stamp out of the fast hardening red stream, it had made a deep official looking design. The man checked everything carefully and stepped back, looked at my father and told him that he was forbidden to open his desk. He turned, grabbing his black leather coat, and walked out of the room. His men followed. They pulled their hats even lower over their faces and pulled up the lapels of their leather coats. Our big wooden entry door slammed shut and heavy boots stomped down the stone stairs. Now, someone asked me, why have you written this memoir? And my first answer was, I've written it for my grandchildren and for people to know that once upon a time there were two Germanys. And then I realized as I was writing it for me as well, because I was revisiting what had happened to me as a child. I was revisiting the places that I still love. And I was actually reconnecting with the people of my past. So I would like to take a big leap that we fled from East Germany with the help of the underground. And we made it to West Berlin and a refugee camp, and then lived in a bombed out house for about 6 weeks. And later we were flown into Western Germany, pardon me, Western Germany, where my father started looking for work. And we traveled all over West Germany. And my father couldn't hold a job because he was drinking, and he was let go from every job. Finally, however, his drinking subsided somehow, and we wound up we settled actually there in Königstein, which is a small town not far from Frankfurt. In Königstein, I spent my teenage years, and I also met my future husband, an American, with whom I immigrated to America, to Oregon, actually. That marriage lasted about 20 years, and we divorced, and we had 2 daughters, and I became a single mother. I would like to read something in a very adult voice. I mentioned that my father was having severe alcoholic problems, and it turns out that that also affected my life. And I'd like to read just a small piece of what that was like. Panic on the old Selwood Bridge. The years that followed were very lonely, even though Bill and I were together as much as possible. During these years, I drank more every night. Since weekends always seemed to belong to families, I felt particularly lonely and depressed. It was painful to be without Bill. Saturdays and Sundays, I began drinking in the morning, starting the day with a glass of champagne or a Bloody Mary. The alcohol seemed to lift my spirits at first, but I didn't feel happy for long. As the day progressed, I'd switch to bourbon and continued to drink until late into the night and oblivion. Many mornings, I couldn't recall what had happened the night before. I had heard about blackouts, but thought they only happened to real alcoholics. One night, I drunkenly wrote in my journal, "Am I an alcoholic?" The next morning, I could hardly read what I had scribbled. I began to question my purpose and who I was or had become. I felt a great emptiness inside of me. I withdrew from friends and coworkers. In my dreams, I experienced fleeing from my home in Galitz again and again. I dreamed of the lonely years that followed with the profound fear of separation and abandonment. The scariest dreams were when I heard air raid sirens in my dreams. They felt so real that I woke trembling with fear. As my drinking escalated, I became more and more isolated. Alcohol had become my refuge. It helped steady my nerves and helped me to forget. Sleeping through the night, though, had become increasingly difficult. I often got up to pour myself another drink in the middle of the night. One weekend morning, I experienced a panic attack. I hadn't been drinking to excess the night before. Daniela, my daughter, had her own apartment. Stephanie, my other daughter, was at her father's, and I was alone at home. I planned to hang pictures in the living room when suddenly my heart started to race. My hands began shaking, and I could hardly breathe. Is that what a heart attack feels like? I asked myself. It surprised me to hear my own voice. I became dizzy and sat down in the middle of the living room floor. I had the sensation of physically sliding deeper and deeper into a black hole. Looking up, I desperately tried to find a way out of the darkness, but I saw none. After what seemed a long time, I pulled myself up on the side of the couch. Nauseous and dizzy, I reached for the phone to call my friend Mary. I don't know what I said to her, but she was at my door quickly. "I think I have a bad flu or something," I told her, shaking uncontrollably. Another anxiety attack happened in a rainstorm on the Selwood Bridge in Portland. The traffic had stopped in the middle of the bridge, and I felt trapped with no way out. I put my head on the steering wheel and said out loud, "This is just like my damn life. I have no control over anything." I felt completely powerless. Traffic didn't move for a long time, and I tried not to look down to the river because I was afraid of heights. Sweating profusely, I grabbed the steering wheel as tightly as I could and tried to calm my breathing. I could barely make out the car in front of me. I was so dizzy. When the traffic finally started to move again, I managed to drive over the bridge. When I reached the other side, I pulled over, stopped the car, and closed my eyes. In the side pocket of my car was a small flask of whiskey. I unscrewed the top with shaky fingers and drained the flask in one gulp. I am happy to say that I have been in recovery for 14 years. And I would like to mention one thing about being a refugee. Most people, especially nowadays, we think of refugees from the Middle East or from Honduras or places like that. But being an East German refugee, is something that most people had never heard of. And a friend once asked me, once a refugee is assimilated into a new country and begins making a new life, is she still a refugee? My answer is that a refugee always remains a refugee. No matter how well a refugee outwardly seems to assimilate or how stable her economic and social conditions appear, she remains a person who fled her homeland. A refugee is forced to leave behind not only possessions, but also deep roots and family. In other words, life. My brother Peter adds that the feeling of loss remains deep and unalterable. So I would like to stop here. Thank you for listening.